In the vast, desolate expanse of a world ravaged by the undead, there was a place that shouldn't exist, a secret, well-hidden colony nestled in the craggy hills of a forgotten wilderness. It had been built under the guise of a research station, funded by a group of survivors who had managed to keep their whereabouts a closely guarded secret from the outside world. There, behind high walls and barbed wire, a small group of humans lived in isolation, believing themselves safe from the horrors of the zombie apocalypse. The colony was known simply as Haven, but there was little about it that resembled peace. Within its concrete walls, the survivors worked tirelessly to maintain their fragile existence, each day a battle to keep the infected at bay. The buildings, though sturdy, were old and deteriorating. Supplies were running low, and morale was slipping. A constant sense of dread hung in the air like the thick fog that rolled in from the surrounding forests at night. Lena, one of the colony's medical doctors, paced nervously through the narrow hallways of the settlement's clinic. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but her mind raced with fear. Something was wrong. The once frequent reports of zombie activity in the nearby woods had suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie silence. It had been days since anyone had seen or heard anything outside the walls. The radios, their only means of communication with the outside world, remained silent as well. The residents of Haven had grown complacent. They had allowed themselves to believe that their location, so remote and hidden, had rendered them invisible to the infected. But Lena knew better. The dead were relentless, and nothing could stop their hunger for human flesh, not walls, not time, and certainly not isolation. Lena's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching. She turned to see Jack, the colony's head of security, his face grim. He had an air of urgency about him, the kind that made her stomach churn. "Lena, we need to talk," Jack said, his voice low. She followed him to the security office, where the screens flickered with images of the perimeter. A few guards manned the watchtower, but they all looked uneasy, scanning the horizon for signs of movement. "What's going on?" Lena asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Jack hesitated before speaking. "There's a breach. We found a section of the wall that's been cut. Someone's been tampering with our defenses." Lena's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, tampering? Who could have gotten this close without us noticing?" "That's what I need to figure out," Jack replied, his brow furrowed in frustration. "But what's worse is that we're getting reports of movement. Not from the dead, but from people." Lena's breath caught in her throat. The possibility that other survivors had found them was a nightmare come to life. Haven had been built to keep out the infected, but what if it wasn't the zombies they had to fear anymore? Jack paused, his eyes searching hers. "Lena, I think someone from inside the colony is working with them." The room fell silent, and Lena felt a chill run down her spine. Betrayal. The word echoed in her mind like a warning bell. Who could it be? They had all sworn an oath to protect the settlement, but trust was a fragile thing in the world they now lived in. "We need to find out who's behind this before it's too late," Jack said, his voice hardening. "And we need to prepare. The dead might be coming for us again, but this time, it might be even worse." Lena nodded, her resolve hardening. The shadows of betrayal had already begun to stretch across the settlement, and soon, they would have to face a new kind of enemy. One that was human. The night fell heavy over Haven, and the usual hum of activity within the settlement shifted into a tense, restless quiet. The usual sound of footsteps and distant chatter had faded, replaced by the murmurs of worried voices. Everyone could feel it, the unease. They were all too aware that something had changed, but no one knew what or who to trust anymore. Lena couldn't shake the sense of impending danger. She had spent the better part of the evening combing through the clinic's records, trying to distract herself from the gnawing worry that consumed her. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary, no signs of sickness or sabotage in the medical logs. The walls were still intact, the guard towers unmanned, and the food reserves, though dangerously low, were holding steady for now. But then there were the reports from the watchtower. The strange figure they'd spotted along the eastern perimeter had vanished before anyone could investigate. Jack's earlier words echoed in Lena's mind, someone from inside the colony is working with them. She couldn't afford to dismiss it. The colony was small, and trust was essential for survival, but paranoia was a more dangerous infection than the zombies themselves. She found herself standing outside the clinic, her eyes scanning the horizon, searching for anything that might confirm her worst fear. The night was still, no distant moans, no howls from the woods. Just silence. But it was the kind of silence that screamed, a tension that hung in the air, suffocating and thick. "Lena, there you are." She turned to see Jack approaching, his face drawn with exhaustion. He had been out for hours, trying to get a handle on the growing chaos. There was a tired look in his eyes, but something more lurked behind it, something darker. "I've been talking to the others," he said quietly. "The guards. They're not the only ones who saw something out there tonight." Lena's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "There's someone, two someones, who've been sneaking around the perimeter. They've been doing it for days, moving under cover of darkness, trying to avoid being seen. Someone's feeding them information, and it's not the dead that are helping them." Lena swallowed hard, the weight of the situation bearing down on her. The colony was in danger, and the threat wasn't just the undead. It was human betrayal, and it was spreading like wildfire. "We can't let them get to the gates," she said, her voice firm. "We need to find out who's behind this before they make their move." Jack nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "We've trusted everyone here, Lena. Everyone. Who could be capable of this? Who could betray us like this?" Lena's gaze drifted over to the clinic's entrance. The faces of the people she had worked alongside, healed, and cared for all flashed in her mind. It could be anyone. The thought of it made her sick to her stomach. As if on cue, the distant sound of a door creaking open caught their attention. Both of them turned sharply. A shadow moved across the alley between the buildings, too fast, too deliberate. Someone was sneaking out, someone who wasn't supposed to be. "Stay here," Jack ordered, his voice low and commanding. "I'll check it out." Lena didn't hesitate. The instant Jack turned away, she slipped into the shadows, following just behind him at a safe distance. Her pulse raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. Whoever was sneaking around at this hour wasn't doing it for a good reason. They were up to something. They followed the shadowy figure through the narrow, dimly lit alleyways, past silent buildings, until they reached a dead end near the outer perimeter. There, hidden beneath the cover of a long-abandoned storage shed, the figure turned, revealing a familiar face. It was Mara, one of the colony's youngest engineers, someone Lena had known since she was a child. But what was she doing here? And why was she out this late? Before Lena could say anything, Mara's eyes met hers, filled with panic. "Please," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Jack stepped forward, his hand gripping his weapon. "Mara, what are you doing out here? What have you been involved in?" Tears welled in the girl's eyes as she sank to her knees. I'm trying to stop it. You have to believe me. They've already gotten inside. I tried to warn you." Lena and Jack exchanged a tense look. They had been wrong, Mara wasn't the enemy. But there were bigger threats, and the truth was more terrifying than either could have imagined. The colony's walls were breached, but not by zombies. The living had betrayed them first. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a cold, pale light over Haven as Lena and Jack led Mara into the security office. The tension in the air was palpable as Mara sat trembling on one of the metal chairs, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had pleaded with them to understand, but her words had been too scattered, too filled with fear, to make sense of at first. Lena sat across from her, trying to steady her racing heart. The girl was terrified, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that only desperation could breed. Jack leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, staring at Mara with suspicion. He was trying to piece together the puzzle in his head, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized how little they truly knew about what was happening. "Tell us everything, Mara," Jack demanded, his voice steely. "What's going on? Who's behind this? Mara's breath came in ragged gasps as she wiped her tear-streaked face. It's not what you think. I didn't want to be part of this. I didn't want to betray anyone. But they promised me protection. They said I could keep you all safe if I helped them. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who else to turn to. Lena leaned forward, her gaze intense. Who promised you protection? Who's behind all of this? Mara's voice trembled. I don't know their names. But they're part of a group, a faction, from the outside. Survivors who are worse than the infected. They've been watching us for months, waiting for the right moment to strike. They told me that Haven would be a perfect base of operations. A place with supplies, a place to rebuild. But they needed to get in first. Lena's heart sank as the pieces began to fall into place. Mara had been coerced, manipulated by people with their own agenda, and now their dangerous game had caught up with them all. She felt a pang of sympathy for the young engineer, but she knew they didn't have time for emotions. The stakes were too high. Jack pushed off the wall and paced. You're telling us that someone from the outside is trying to take us down? That they've been feeding information to someone inside the colony? Mara nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Yes. They've been sneaking people in. They've got someone on the inside who's been helping them get closer. They know the weak points, the blind spots. They know our schedules, our patrols, everything. Lena's blood ran cold. There was a traitor among them, someone who had access to all the secrets of Haven, someone who had been feeding this unknown faction the very information they needed to tear everything apart. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Who is it? Jack demanded. Who's the traitor? Mara shook her head. I don't know. But they've been moving in the shadows. I overheard things, pieces of conversations, but I never thought it would come to this. I thought I could stop it, warn you before it was too late. But it's happening now. They're coming. Jack cursed under his breath. We're sitting ducks, then. Lena stood, her mind racing with the implications of Mara's words. The colony's downfall was no longer a distant fear. It was happening now, and they had no time to waste. She turned to Jack, her decision firm. We need to act quickly. If there's a traitor among us, we need to find them before they can do any more damage. We can't wait for them to make their move. We need to track them down, now. Jack gave a sharp nod. Agreed. But we'll need to split up, cover more ground. We can't waste any time. Lena's eyes locked with Mara's. The girl had helped them, but it was clear that she was caught in the middle of a much larger, more dangerous game than she had realized. But Lena couldn't afford to focus on that now. They needed to survive. Stay close to us, Mara. If you really want to help, you'll need to stay out of sight. We don't know who's watching, or who's on their side. Mara nodded quickly, the fear still etched in her features. She understood the gravity of the situation now. No longer just a frightened young woman looking for safety, she had become a reluctant ally in their fight for survival. As Jack and Lena made their way toward the outer walls, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on them. The walls of Haven were supposed to protect them, but now they felt more like a trap. Every shadow seemed deeper, every movement more suspicious. They had to find the traitor, and they had to do it fast. But with every step, Lena wondered, how could they trust anyone anymore when even the walls had turned against them? The cold, dead air of the night felt heavier than usual, and the quiet of Haven was deafening as Lena, Jack, and Mara ventured into the heart of the colony. There was no turning back now. The truth had been laid bare, someone was working against them from the inside, feeding information to a ruthless faction intent on taking over. Lena couldn't help but feel the weight of it all, the trust they had placed in each other, shattered in an instant. The outer walls loomed ahead, a solid barrier that once seemed impenetrable. But now, they felt more like a tomb. Jack led the way, his gaze constantly scanning the shadows, while Mara stayed close behind, her nervousness palpable. Whoever's behind this has to be careful, Jack muttered under his breath, his voice tight with frustration. They've covered their tracks well. Lena could feel the same unease. The colony had been a sanctuary, a place where the remaining humans could rebuild. But now it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, and the safety they had once taken for granted was slipping through their fingers. They reached the security office, where the colony's surveillance footage was stored. Lena took a deep breath as Jack unlocked the door. Inside, the hum of the monitors filled the small room. They were all running a constant loop of the perimeter, the guard towers, and the various sections of the colony. But the footage wasn't enough. It didn't tell them who was pulling the strings from within. Let's go through the records again, Jack said, sitting down at the terminal. We need to see who's been coming and going, who's been acting strange lately. Everyone's a suspect now. Lena nodded, her thoughts still churning. The traitor could be anyone, someone they'd worked with, someone they'd trusted. It was terrifying to think about, but they had no choice. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. Mara paced anxiously behind them, unable to sit still. I've been trying to help. I swear I never wanted to get involved in this, she said, her voice cracking. But they told me that if I didn't, they'd hurt the people I care about. Lena glanced at her, her expression softening. Mara wasn't a villain in this story. She was a victim, forced into a position where survival meant betraying everything she believed in. But that didn't change the reality of the situation. They were all in danger. We're going to figure this out, Mara, Lena said quietly. We're going to find out who's behind this. Just as Jack began to sift through the footage, the radio crackled to life, breaking the tension in the room. It was a voice, distorted and urgent. Jack, Lena, this is Caleb at the West Watchtower. We've got a problem. Both of them were on alert in an instant. Caleb was one of their most reliable guards. If he was calling for help, something serious was happening. What's going on? Jack asked, his hand already on his sidearm. There's movement. I've spotted a group of people on the outskirts, moving fast. They're not infected, Caleb said, his voice tight with fear. And they're heading straight for the gates. Jack and Lena exchanged a glance. It was happening. The attack was imminent. Caleb, hold your position. Don't engage until we get there, Jack ordered. We'll be there in 10 minutes. Lena's stomach dropped as they raced toward the gates. Every instinct told her that this wasn't just a random raid, it was coordinated. The group wasn't just trying to break into the colony, they were trying to breach it from the inside out. As they reached the gates, they saw Caleb, his rifle raised, keeping watch over a small group of people moving through the darkness. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces hidden behind scarves or masks. They were too organized to be simple looters, they were military, trained, and they knew exactly what they were doing. Jack signaled for Lena to stay back as he moved forward, calling out to Caleb. The guard lowered his rifle, but his eyes never left the group. I don't recognize any of them, Caleb muttered. They came out of nowhere. Lena's mind raced as she watched the strangers advance. The treacherous faction Mara had warned them about was here, and they weren't just looking for supplies, they were looking for something else. But what? Stay hidden, Lena whispered to Mara, who had followed them to the gates. If this is what I think it is, we need to stay out of sight. Mara nodded, her face pale but resolute. Jack crouched low as he made his way toward the approaching group, his movements precise. He was close now, close enough to hear them murmuring amongst themselves. I've got the intel, one of the strangers said, his voice cold and confident. The traitor's already inside. We just need to make sure Haven falls tonight. We'll have control by morning. Lena's blood ran cold. The traitor wasn't just working for them, they were leading them. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The hunt for the traitor had just become a race against time. And as the strangers prepared to make their move, Lena knew one thing for sure, they were running out of time. The tension in the air felt like a live wire, crackling with impending danger. Lena and Jack watched in the shadows, their eyes trained on the strangers who had appeared at the gates. The words that had fallen from the man's lips echoed in Lena's mind, the traitor's already inside. We just need to make sure Haven falls tonight. Her stomach churned, a knot tightening with every passing second. This wasn't just an external attack, it was a coordinated strike, a betrayal that ran deeper than any of them could have imagined. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and the traitor among them was guiding the enemy right to their doorstep. Jack motioned for Lena to stay put as he slowly advanced, crouching low, his movements careful and calculated. He'd been trained for situations like this, silent, methodical. But even he could feel the weight of the stakes pressing on him, the threat of the unknown traitor lurking in the shadows. Lena's mind was racing. She glanced back at Mara, who stood just behind her, her eyes wide with fear. The young engineer hadn't been trained for this. She was just a pawn in a game much larger than herself, and now, she was part of the very battle they had been trying to avoid. Lena squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, trying to focus, trying to piece together the fragments of the plan that was unraveling in front of her. She knew that they couldn't afford to let the attackers breach Haven. If they did, the colony would be lost. And whatever power the traitor had within the walls would be the final blow. We need to get to the control room, Lena whispered to Mara, her voice low but urgent. We need to lock down the gates, secure the perimeter. If we can cut off their entry, we might have a chance to contain the situation. Mara nodded, her face pale but resolute. She was still in shock, but the severity of the situation was starting to hit her. The group at the gates had started to move, spreading out in calculated patterns as if they knew exactly where to go, exactly where the weak points in Haven's defenses were. There was no more time to waste. Lena and Mara moved quickly through the colony's dark streets, heading for the control room where the gate mechanisms were housed. It wasn't far, but it felt like an eternity as every corner seemed to hold a new threat, every creak in the shadows a possible warning. By the time they reached the control room, the alarms had begun to sound, their shrill wail cutting through the night. Jack had initiated the lockdown protocol from the outside, but the attackers had already breached the outer perimeter. Lena and Mara moved inside quickly, locking the door behind them as they rushed to the control panels. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with the sense of a battle already lost. Lena's hands flew over the control panel, her fingers shaking with adrenaline. She needed to stop the gates from opening. If the enemy got inside, it was all over. What do we do? Mara asked, her voice trembling. Pull up the security grid, Lena replied, her voice steady despite the panic rising within her chest. We need to cut off their movements. Lock down the internal sectors. Mara hesitated, her fingers hovering over the buttons. There's one problem. If we lock down the interior, we'll trap ourselves inside too. Lena cursed under her breath. They couldn't risk being trapped. But they also couldn't afford to leave the enemy unchecked. As the seconds ticked by, Lena made a split-second decision. She selected the emergency override, which would lock down all entrances and exits, but it also activated an internal lockdown that would block their access to the rest of the settlement. She had no choice. We'll make it work, Lena said, her voice low. The gates will hold long enough for us to figure out how to push them back. Mara nodded, her fear tempered by the urgency in Lena's voice. They had no other choice. If the attackers broke through, they would be swarmed, and that was a fate they couldn't afford to let happen. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the hum of the machines as the lockdown initiated. The gates groaned and creaked as they slowly began to close, sealing off Haven's entrance. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a voice from the other side of the control room door. It's too late, Lena. Lena froze, her blood running cold. The voice was unmistakable, smooth, calculated, and chilling. It was Connor. The colony's head of engineering. The traitor. Lena's breath caught in her throat. How had he found them so quickly? How had he known exactly where to go? Before she could react, the door to the control room slammed open, and Connor stepped inside, his dark eyes gleaming with cold triumph. Behind him, two other armed men entered, their faces hidden behind masks. You've been too busy playing catch-up, Connor continued, his voice dripping with disdain. The gates are already compromised. The colony will fall. It's just a matter of time. Lena stood frozen, her hands still on the emergency override. She felt betrayed, enraged, but also strangely resigned. Connor had been a trusted ally, a leader. To see him standing there, the very embodiment of their downfall, was almost too much to comprehend. But she couldn't afford to waste any more time. "You won't win," Lena spat, her voice low and defiant. "We'll fight to the last breath." Connor's smile widened. "I don't need to win. I just need you to lose." He nodded to his men, signaling them to approach. The battle for Haven had officially begun, and this time, it was against a traitor they had once called their own. The control room, once a place of authority and calm, now felt like a cage. The hum of the lockdown system and the distant echo of the gates shutting were the only sounds breaking the oppressive silence. Connor stood before Lena, his cold eyes gleaming with victory, while his masked accomplices flanked him, weapons drawn and ready. Lena's heart raced, but her mind was calm, calculating. She couldn't let panic take over. Not now. Not when the fate of Haven, and everyone inside, depended on her. "We don't have to do this, Connor," she said, her voice steady despite the anger boiling inside her. "You're better than this. You're better than them." Connor let out a low chuckle. "Better? No, Lena. I'm just more practical. Haven was always a fragile little dream, a temporary sanctuary for the weak. We're in the real world now. The survivors out there, they know what it takes to stay alive. And they want what Haven has. The resources, the infrastructure. You were never meant to keep this all to yourselves. You were always meant to fall." Behind him, one of his men stepped forward, the barrel of his rifle gleaming in the dim light. But Lena didn't flinch. "Not now. You've sold your soul to them," Lena spat. "The faction outside, what is it you've really promised them, Connor? What's the price of your betrayal?" Connor's smile faltered, just for a split second, before he regained his composure. "It's not about promises, Lena. It's about power. What they've offered me, what they've given me, is freedom. And control. Something you could never offer." Lena's eyes narrowed. She could feel the anger rising, but she forced herself to think. There had to be a way out of this. There had to be something they could do to stop this madness. Before she could speak again, the sound of pounding footsteps came from the hallway outside. The attackers were making their move. They were close, too close. Time was running out. "What's happening outside?" Mara's voice broke through, her fear palpable as she edged toward the control panel. "What are they doing?" Lena's gaze flicked to the monitors. The attackers weren't just waiting, they were advancing through the settlement, cutting through the guard stations, moving toward the heart of Haven. Every step they took brought them closer to the precious resources that had kept the colony alive. And every step they took brought them closer to the collapse of everything they had worked for. Connor's smile widened, sensing the fear in the air. "Your people are already dead, Lena. You should have surrendered when you had the chance." The words stung, but Lena forced herself to remain calm. She had no intention of surrendering, not to him, and certainly not to anyone who sought to destroy everything they had built. "Jack," Lena said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension. "Now." Jack's voice came through the radio, his tone grim. "I'm in position. On your mark." Lena's hand hovered over the override button. If she activated it now, the gates would seal completely, trapping everyone inside. But it would also prevent the attackers from getting any further. The choice wasn't easy, it meant putting themselves at the mercy of whatever was still lurking in Haven, but it was the only move left. Connor's eyes darkened as he saw what she was about to do. "Don't you dare." "I will," Lena replied, her voice unwavering. She pressed the button. The gates behind them groaned as the secondary lockdown took effect. The outer perimeter was sealed, but the internal passageways remained accessible. For now. Mara's breath hitched. "What's happening? What's going on?" Lena didn't answer. She couldn't afford to explain. The only thing that mattered now was survival. Connor's fury erupted. You've sealed your fate, Lena. You won't get out of here alive. He lunged forward, his gun raised, but before he could pull the trigger, Jack burst into the room, his rifle aimed squarely at Connor's chest. Step away from her, Jack commanded, his voice low and deadly. Connor froze, the sudden shift in power taking him by surprise. His hand trembled for a moment, but he didn't lower his weapon. Instead, he sneered. You think you've won? You've just delayed the inevitable. You'll die with your colony. You'll all be crushed under the weight of your own foolishness. Maybe, Jack said, his gaze unflinching. But we'll take you down with us. In the silence that followed, it was clear that Haven's future hung in the balance. The traitor was in their midst, but they had one final chance to reclaim it. Lena made a split-second decision. She rushed to the emergency hatch beneath the control panel, a narrow escape route that led to the deeper parts of Haven, the old underground network that had once served as a last line of defense. It was their only hope. Jack! Lena shouted, urgency in her voice. We can't waste any more time. We have to move now. Jack didn't hesitate. He moved to cover Lena, his rifle trained on Connor and his men as they backed away, unwilling to engage in a full-scale shootout. They were outnumbered, and they knew it. Lena and Mara dove into the hatch, the heavy metal doors slamming shut behind them. The last sound they heard was the distant clash of battle echoing from the upper levels, but there was no turning back now. They were trapped underground, cut off from the surface and from the fight above. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of their last stand. From here, they would take back what was theirs, no matter the cost. And as Lena's footsteps echoed down the dim hallway, she knew this much: Haven wasn't dead yet. Not while there was still a breath left in her lungs.